Bright City Church. How's everyone doing this morning? Yeah? Thanks, Alex. Well, if you're new, my name is Sharon. I'm one of the pastors here at Bright City. And I have to say, guys, I have missed the last 2 Sundays because I was out of town. And I've never done that before, where I've missed 2 in a row in the life of our church. And I have missed you guys so much. And it has been so wonderful being back and worshiping with you this morning. But if you are new, welcome. Bright City Church exists to help people take their next step towards God. And so however you came in here this morning, whatever your story, whatever your questions, whatever your pain, our question for you is, what is your next step towards Christ? And how can we partner with you on that journey? Now, if you are new, your first step is to simply let us know that you are here. And there's a really easy way that you can do that. If you scan that QR code and click new here, fill that out, we will follow up with you and get you connected. And then also, Ike and I will be available in the lobby immediately after the service. There is a banner that says new here. We will be standing there. We'll have a gift for you. We're there to answer any questions that you have as well. And so that is immediately after the service. Now, if you consider Bright City Church your home, maybe your next step is to give. We talk about giving and generosity as an act of worship. It's how we tangibly demonstrate the priority of God in our lives. And so if you consider Bright City Church your home, but you are not yet participating in the life of our church that way, we would invite you to either scan the QR code, or you can actually go to brightcitychurch.com/give to set up automatic monthly giving. And then one final way that you can get plugged in at our church is through serving. We become more like Christ as we serve one another. And there's so many different ways to serve. But one that immediately leapt to mind this morning actually is that we need more instrumentalists. We have a lot of amazing vocalists, but we're actually in great need of more instrumentalists. And so if you play an instrument and you would be willing to serve, we would be so grateful to have you. But if you are someone that standing on a stage sounds like your actual nightmare, we have other roles as well that we would love to tell you about. And so you can just scan that QR code and click serve. Now, in terms of announcements, we have 3 major ones coming up. First is this Wednesday. We have our monthly prayer gathering, which is at 7 p.m. at the church offices. This is a very casual gathering. We have some worship and then a time to pray over one another, to pray over our church, to pray for our community and world. And it is such, I treasure this gathering once a month. It's free. We don't, here at the movie theater, we have to be kind of in and out. And so things are kind of structured and moving along, but there's a lot more freedom to just listen to the Spirit on Wednesday nights. And so if you're looking for a space like that, it's at 7 p.m. at the church offices. And then next Sunday, we have another monthly event called Pizza with the Pastors. It's something we do once a month after the second service, where if you are new or newish, we will walk over to California Pizza Kitchen for lunch. I will be there. Ike will be there. Some of our other staff will be there as well, just to answer any questions that you have about our church and get to know us better as well. And so if you're interested in attending that, if you would RSVP and let us know, just so that we can go ahead and order enough pizza in advance. And then the final announcement that I have is Alex is actually modeling it right now, which is that we have hats for sale in the lobby. This is something that we once had hats. I think it was in the first year of our church, and ever since people have asked, when are you going to bring back hats? And so we have now brought them back, and we have them in 3 different colors. Alex is modeling the olive color. Do not call it green. Do not call it green. He is correcting me every time. And then we also have timber, which also is apparently not yellow. So we have olive, we have timber, and then we have black, which I'm like, why isn't it like fancy? Like, yeah, charcoal? I don't know. It's just black. So we've got these 3 colors, but they're on sale in the lobby for $15. And part of the reason why we have these hats is not just because people have been asking for them, but also it's an organic way to tell people about Bright City. And with Easter being less than a month away, which is really crazy, we're just a few weeks out from Easter, we really want to encourage you to be praying about who you can invite to Easter. And in that vein, starting next week, we're kicking off a short 3-week series called This Is My Testimony. I'm really excited about it. We are going to be hearing testimonies from our own staff. And part of the reason why we're doing this is just to remind you, as we're going into Easter, to remind you of the different ways that people encounter Jesus and the different needs that people bring to Jesus so that you have your eyes open to the people around you. But we also, part of the reason we're hearing specifically from our staff, and Alex is actually going to be one of them who's going to be sharing his testimony, is we want you to know that the reason that any of us are leading at Bright City is not because we are really good at Christianity. The reason that we are leading at Bright City is because Jesus rescued us. And so we want you guys to hear that story from our own mouths. And so we're so pumped for this series as we lead up to Easter. And be sure, if you're interested, to grab a hat in the lobby immediately after the service. So that's all I have for you. And now I'm going to introduce Samantha to read scripture.
Good morning. I'm Samantha, or Sam, whichever. And I am part of the liturgical worship and guest service teams here at Bright City. And I would like to invite you to stand, if you are able, for the reading of God's word. And we'll be reading from Isaiah 58, 3 through 11. Why we have fasted, but you have not seen. We have denied ourselves, but you haven't noticed. Look, you do as you please on the day of your fast and oppress your workers. You fast with contention and strife. To strike viciously with your fist. You cannot fast as you do today, hoping to make your voice heard on high. Will the fast I choose be like this? A day for a person to deny himself, to bow his head like a reed, and to spread out sackcloth and ashes? Will you call this a fast and a day acceptable to the Lord? Isn't this the fast I choose? To break the chains of wickedness, to untie the ropes of the yoke, and to set the oppressed free, and to tear off every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the poor and homeless into your house, to clothe the naked when you see him, and not to ignore your own flesh and blood? Then your light will appear like the dawn, and your recovery will come quickly. Your righteousness will go before you, and the Lord's glory will be your rear guard. At that time, when you call, the Lord will answer. When you cry out, he will say, "Here I am." If you get rid of the yoke among you, the finger pointing and malicious speaking, and if you offer yourselves to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted one, then your light will shine in the darkness, and your night will be like noonday. The Lord will always lead you, satisfy you in the parched land, and strengthen your bones. You will be like a watered garden, and like a spring whose water never runs dry. This is the word of the Lord.
Sam, you guys can be seated. This morning I wanted to start out in kind of an unusual place as we jump into this message. I wanted to start with a clip from the movie Moana. Yeah, that's what you would expect, right? Some of you may be familiar with this movie, others not so much, but Moana is a princess, and so she is the little girl in this clip. And as you watch this clip, I want you to pay attention to where Moana's focus is versus where the focus of her parents and the villagers are.
Moana, make way, make way. Moana, it's time you knew. The village of Motunui is all you need. The dancers are practicing. They dance to an ancient song.
Who needs a new song? This old one's all we need.
This tradition is our mission, and Moana, there's so much to do. Don't trip on the terror route, that's all you need. We share everything we make. We joke and we weave our baskets. The fishermen come back from the sea. Don't walk away. Moana, stay on the ground now. Our people will need a chief, and there you are. There comes a day when you're gonna look around and realize happiness is where you are. Consider the coconut, consider its trees, each part of the coconut, that's all we need.
We make our nets from the fibers, the water is sweet inside. We use the leaves to build fires, cook up the meat inside.
Consider the coconuts, the trunks and the leaves, the island gives us what we need. That's right, we stay, we're safe and we're well provided. And when we look to the future, there you are. You'll be okay. In time you'll learn just as I did. You must find happiness right where you are.
All right, so for those that aren't as familiar with this movie, where's Moana's focus? It's the water, the sea. She wants to be in the water. But the family and her parents and the village are focused on the tradition and the ceremony. And towards the end of that clip, we see they're having this ceremony where she is becoming princess, and they're caught up in that. And then they look down and realize that she is gone. This passage from Isaiah 58 that we are looking at this morning, what we see in this passage is a people who had become very caught up in the ceremony and the practice of fasting, but in so doing, looked up eventually and realized God was not there. In essence, God was not interested in their ceremony. God was not interested in their practice because it did not lead them to care about the things that God cared about, in particular, the poor and the oppressed. And so this morning, as we wrap up this series that we've been in on fasting, I want to look at a reason that we fast that maybe has never been kind of brought to your attention before. Maybe you're not as familiar with that. And that is, we fast to stand with the poor and the marginalized. To give you some statistics around poverty in our world, 2 billion of our global population live in poverty. And about 10% of that, or 700 million, live in extreme poverty, meaning they live on less than $2 a day. In America, the percentages are even higher, with 11.6% living in extreme poverty, which is about 40 million, most of which are children. And we know that when we look worldwide, 22,000 children die every day due to poverty. Contrast that then on the other side, the average American family spends $1,500 a year on food that is thrown out. 40% of food in America is thrown out, which is a shocking statistic. That translates to 160 billion pounds of food waste per year. And so what we see in this disparity is that there are millions who are hungry, and then there are millions more of us who have more than we know what to do with. And so as we wrap up this series, we are looking at fasting finally as a practice from the way of Jesus that helps us stand in the gap of this disparity. Going back to our passage, beginning in verse 3, we see Israel is sort of asking God this question: why have we fasted, but you have not seen? We have denied ourselves, but you haven't noticed. In other words, they're doing this to get something from God. God responds, look, you do as you please on the day of your fast and oppress all your workers. You fast with contention and strife to strike viciously with your fist. You cannot fast as you do today, hoping to make your voice heard on high. Will the fast I choose be like this? A day for a person to deny himself, to bow his head like a reed, and to spread out sackcloth and ashes? Will you call this a fast and a day acceptable to the Lord? God's essentially asking, is it enough that you just kind of ceremonially bow your head and spread out sackcloth and ashes? That's not what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for a tradition here. I'm looking for something more. Old Testament scholar Christopher Seitz says this about this passage. He says, fasting cannot become mechanized, for it will devolve into ceremony without proper consequence. What is that proper consequence? We see in verse 6, God says, isn't this the fast that I choose? To break the chains of wickedness, to untie the ropes of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, and to tear off every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the poor and homeless into your house, to clothe the naked when you see him, and not to ignore your own flesh and blood. Christopher Seitz, going on, says, fasting that does not alleviate these conditions but worsens them stands under prophetic condemnation. Fasting is meant to be a response of penitence and contrition, seeking God's favor. In other words, what we see in this passage is the people who have developed this habit of fasting, believing it's going to get them something from God. It's going to put God in their debt. Now God owes them because of the way that they've denied themselves. And the scholar is saying, no, and fasting is something we come to in humility, in contrition, with a proper motivation. And the proper motivation we see in this passage is justice, specifically the need for release from bondage. And so the concern here is that fasting, with so many different spiritual practices and spiritual formation habits, can become a source of sort of personal piety and self-righteousness. And yes, as we've looked through the series, fasting is about developing self-discipline and self-control over our passions and desires, but that is not to be an end in itself. Rather, that work is to lead us towards a place where we have quieted the noise that competes with God's voice and have tuned our spirits to hear God's voice more clearly so that we can see and hear what God's heart is, what his desires are for us, and go do them. This takes us back to the series that we started the year with the priorities of Jesus, and in particular looking at Jesus' priorities of generosity and care for the marginalized. When we look at this passage, we see that God's cares and concerns here are breaking chains of wickedness. Those are in individual sin, but also in our sins against one another. In seeing the oppressed set free, in feeding the hungry, in clothing the naked, and bringing homes for the homeless. And so what I want to do in our time this morning as we look over this text is look at 3 ways that fasting orients us towards the poor and the marginalized. The first one of these, as we've talked throughout this series, we've talked about fasting is fasting from food, but it can be fasting from other things. And so first we're going to look at how fasting from food orients us towards the poor and the marginalized. When we fast from food, the hunger pangs awaken us to the suffering of those whose hunger pangs are not voluntary. In our fasting, the hunger pangs that we experience orient us towards those who experience these every day, not by choice, but by cause of their circumstances, and wakens us to the need for greater food equity in our world. The reason that fasting is important in this way is because it is easy to minimize the plight of another when we have not experienced or have not had to experience their pain in our own bodies. It's much easier to dismiss it as less significant when we haven't experienced it in our own bodies. And so fasting says that your pain is not invisible to me. Your pain is not hypothetical to me. This was the power, one of the powers of Jesus' incarnation is the solidarity that it communicated with us. That our pain and our brokenness was not hypothetical to him. That he came and experienced in his own body. Elizabeth O'Connor, writing in The Search for Silence, says this, that when she was reflecting on fasting, she reflected more on Christ's suffering and the suffering of those who are hungry and have hungry babies. Maybe a practical sort of practice for you and your family as a way of expressing this similar kind of solidarity. One of the things that I've seen families will do is once a week they will have a rice and beans meal, basically where they eat rice and beans as a way of demonstrating solidarity with the world's poor. The New Testament scholar Scott McKnight writes this. He said, "Food joins humans to other humans because we share meals together. Whenever we give up food intentionally, we refrain from relationships. When a group protests by fasting, they both negate one relationship with the haves, and they firm another relationship with the have-nots. And since the structures of power always have sufficient food, fasting is not only refusing relationship, but it is also protesting the power structures that exist. This leads to the second ways that fasting orients us towards the poor and the marginalized, and that is fasting from the comforts of our socioeconomic status or class. When we fast from the comforts of our socioeconomic status or class, the discomforts awaken us to the vulnerability of the poor and the marginalized. Generally speaking, we have a fairly middle-class congregation, and there are certain comforts that come with this, but it also adapts us to certain circles, certain areas of town, certain streets, certain stores that we will shop in that keep us comfortable. And so I'm wondering what it would open our eyes to if we fasted from the comfort of our circles and shops in areas of town that we are comfortable in. Maybe shopping in a lower income area, or for those of us who are white and accustomed to being the majority in every space that we go into, intentionally entering spaces where we are the minority. The important thing here being it helps us to understand the psychological challenge of being in the minority. A less charged example of this might be several years ago, I saw this advertisement for a community play date at the park. And so I decided, we've got toddlers, we've got young kids, so that seems like a good thing to do on a Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock when I've got the kids. So I show up at this park with our kids and quickly become aware of what makes me different. There were 15 moms and about 2 dads. And I quickly kind of became aware of all of my insecurities in this moment. Starting to wonder, okay, are they thinking, does this guy not have a job? Or like, this guy's poor wife, she must have to be at work because he's deadbeat and will not go and get a job, right? Like all of these fears of what everyone around you is thinking about you and the questions that they're wondering about you. And again, I realize our society has changed. It's okay to be a dad at the park at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, but it wakens you up to the insecurities and the psychological challenge of being in the minority. When we are awakened to economic injustice, it moves us to action that can include fasting as a form of resistance. And so John Mark Comer says in our video this week, fasting is a way for the powerful to voluntarily align with the powerless. Finally, a third way that fasting orients us towards the poor and the marginalized is that fasting from our consumerism awakens us to the ways we use our wealth to soothe ourselves. When consuming goods is our primary tool for coping with life, it makes it very difficult for us to be generous. This has been a big part of this fasting series for me. Before we started this series, I was beginning to become aware of the ways in which I was using purchasing new things as a way of escaping negative feelings, or to distract me from negative feelings with the excitement of something new that was on the way. And so as I began to explore this, I began to realize that this sort of unnecessary or impulse purchasing was blocking my vision for something that I should be bringing before God. And so I wanted to share with you this morning my list of sort of the things that I have been tempted to buy in the last week and a half to use for this purpose. And this was very easy to find just by looking up my Amazon browsing history. But here are a few things on my list. One of them was a second computer charger so that I have one at home and at work. The convenience of not having to wrap my cord and take it with me to work. Another Apple Watch band, even though I have 3 or 4 of them. I was looking at getting a hard copy of a digital book that I already owned. A pair of shoes to wear around the house, just around the house. And then a chair for our bedroom to make it a little bit more comfortable. This was my list of almost $600 worth of things that I did not need, but in the impulse to buy or to make my life more convenient and distract me, to give me some excitement, something to look forward to. This was a few of those purchases. And fasting from these purchases not only helps me see how consuming goods is a means of pacifying or distracting from negative feelings that I should be bringing before God, but it also awakens me to the fact that this is a luxury that I have the means to even cope in this way. And so as we think about how we leverage our fasting for the poor and the marginalized, I want to give you a couple of ideas that actually come from early church documents. The first is from Caesarius of Arles in France. This was from the 6th century. He said, "Let us fast in such a way that we lavish our lunches upon the poor, so that we may not store up in our purses what we have intended to eat, but rather in the stomachs of the poor." The Shepherd of Hermas, which is an early Christian document from about the 2nd century, says, "Estimate the cost of the food you would have eaten on that day and give that amount to a widow or orphan or someone in need. Be humble in this way, that the one who receives something because of your humility may fill his soul and pray to the Lord for you." To bring this home a little bit more, 1 John chapter 3, verses 16 through 18 says this: "This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down ourselves for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth." Maybe for you it's not fasting from food, but maybe it's a creature comfort that you're choosing to fast from, or maybe it's that second computer charger that you don't really need. Whatever it is, taking what you would have contributed to that and instead offering to pay for a meal or providing a donation to an organization that you believe in. But the power of this is what we are doing in this moment is we are taking a practice that we typically think of doing out of devotion to God, out of love for God, and leveraging it now for the love of our neighbor. That through this one act, we are both loving God and loving our neighbor. Maybe some places that you can consider contributing, some places that we've contributed are Durham Rescue Mission, the Interfaith Food Shuttle. World Relief is one that we've partnered with for refugee care. The Food Bank of North Carolina is another great one that helps prevent the unnecessary disposal of food. But as we come to the end of this passage, verse 8, we kind of hear how God responds when we fast according to his fast. Verse 8, "Then your light will appear like the dawn, and your recovery will come quickly. Your righteousness will go before you, and the Lord's glory will be your rear guard. At that time, when you call, the Lord will answer. When you cry out, he will say, 'Here I am.' If you get rid of the yoke among you, the finger pointing and malicious speaking, and if you offer yourself to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted one, then your light will shine in the darkness, and your night will be like noonday. The Lord will always lead you, satisfy you in a parched land, and strengthen your bones. You will be like a watered garden and like a spring whose water never runs dry." What God is saying to his people is, let your fasting lead you to where I am, and then I will be near you. Let it lead you to care for the things that I care about. I want to share the story of a woman by the name of Mama Maggie. Maybe you've heard of her. She was a woman in Cairo who gave up her affluent life as a professor of computer science at the American University of Cairo to care for the children of Egypt's garbage slums. In reflecting on this work, she writes this: "When one has nothing, God becomes everything. When I listen to a poor child, I'm listening to God's heart beating for all humanity. When I touch a poor child, I touch Jesus Christ." What she discovered in this work is that there is a radical tangibility to God's presence with the poor and the marginalized. And that if we want to be close to God, that entails being close to those who are suffering. began this message with this clip from Moana and how her eyes were on the water. And if her parents' focus was really on what Moana was focused on, they would know that if they wanted meaningful relationship with her, they needed to go where she wanted to be, which was in the water. God's eyes are on the poor. And if we want meaningful connection with God, we can do that by being with Him where He is and caring for those He cares about. And so as we wrap up this series on fasting, I want to say that it is all well and good to practice fasting out of devotion to God, but if our practice of fasting does not help us to see more clearly what God cares about, then we have missed the point. Let your fasting help you fix your eyes on God's eyes so that you can see what God's eyes are on, so you can see what He cares about, and then put your focus and your attention there also. I want to invite you to bow your heads as we pray together and just take a moment to reflect on what it looks like to put our focus and attention where God's focus and attention is. God, we thank you for your scriptures. We thank you for the ways that it shakes us out of our rituals that we so easily get caught up in. God, would you take us back to a place of urgency for the things that you care about? Take us back to a place of where we started when we began these practices, out of a desire to see you, a desire to know you, a desire to know what you wanted us to do with our lives. That out of love we would obey your commands. God, this morning we focus our eyes again once on you. God, would we not get so caught up in our practices, the things that we're comfortable in, the places that we are comfortable, but God, that we would break out of those to see the needs of your people around us. I want to give you a moment just to pray, to reflect, to meet God. Wherever you are this morning, we're going to have our prayer folks available if you would like to come forward for prayer, but we just want to take a moment to rest in God's presence as we prepare for communion.